Hey guys, what's up? My name is Valerie. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on const variables in JavaScript. So if you are a beginner and you're wondering why we make use of const variables, stick with me in this video where I break things down so that in your next project or program, you can make use of const variables without a sweat. All right, everyone. So in this video, I wanted to take some time to talk about variables in JavaScript that are declared with the const keyword. So for the purpose of this video, I am assuming that you are coming from a more beginner's background with JavaScript and you're just trying to tighten your understanding of certain moving pieces within the JavaScript ecosystem. So with const variables, they are what we should be using when we want to declare constant values. So like the name suggests, const being short for constant, we typically use const variables for values that we won't be changing throughout the course of our program. So certain examples of this can be anything such as setting environment variables or declaring functions that we plan to reuse, or perhaps setting up some kind of schema or a data object of some kind. Const variables also share certain similarities with let variables, and for those of you who are wondering, I do also a video on let variables in JavaScript, so if you are looking for a little bit more understanding on those, you can definitely check that video out. And const variables essentially are what we call block scoped, which means that they can be declared and accessed from within a block. So for example, a block being something like an if block or a function block or a loop as well. Const variables can also be declared in the global scope, which is the scope that exists outside of any block. And from within a block, you can still make access to globally scoped const variables, just like you can with let and var. So I'm going to walk through the first basic example, which is just a basic declaration of a const variable. So whenever you declare a variable in JavaScript, you do start with its keyword. So in this situation, we're going to be using the const keyword, and then we'll give our variable a name. And then I'll just set this to a string of the word bread. So when we log this to the console, we should expect to see our string. And when I save and refresh, we'll get that printed to the console. Okay. Now the next example I want to go through is the fact that we need to initialize a const variable at the same time that we declare a const variable. So what that looks like is basically if I declare a const variable called mood as an example, I can't do this. So let me try and log this to the console and show you what I mean. So we basically made a declaration of this mood variable, but we haven't initialized it to a value. This will not fly in our JavaScript program because as you guys can see, we get an uncaught syntax error missing initializer in const declaration. And the reason is because we haven't initialized it to a value. We're not allowed to do this. Const variables need to be initialized upon declaration, and the value that it's initialized at cannot be reassigned. So what that means is I need to set this to some kind of value upon the time that I declare it. So now when I refresh, our error goes away and we see the value that we set this variable to be. Okay, so that's the next example. Now, another thing with const variables is that, like I mentioned, they cannot be reassigned. Otherwise, that would defeat the purpose of a constant value. So what I mean here is we already have a variable of mood and it's set to a string happy. If I decided I wanted to say mood is now equal to sad, this would not fly in our JavaScript program. So let me try and log this to the console again. So I'll just log mood to the console. Let me refresh. So now we see on line 8 uncaught type error assignment to constant variable, meaning that we've made a reassignment or we've made an assignment to an already declared and initialized const variable. So we're not able to reassign mood to anything because it already has a value, and that's where we get this error showing up in our console. Now, the next example that I want to show you guys is somewhat similar. If, for example, we had a constant variable that we set to be called house, and we decided to assign this to a value of home, and then let's say we wanted to redeclare this house variable and set it to a different value of apartment, we're gonna end up with a similar issue here. So if we log this to the console and I want to print out my variable to the console and I refresh, now we're going to get this error, uncaught syntax error, identifier house has already been declared. So we already identified a constant variable of house, and then we decided we wanted to redeclare and initialize the same variable. That's also not going to work. So keep in mind that when you are working with const variables, you have to be very careful with how you use them, because they are intended to be declared and initialized at a value that is not going to change through the course of your program. In this next example, I'm going to be focusing on const variables that are set to objects. So essentially, when we declare a const variable as an object, we are allowed to reassign values to the object's properties or keys, but we cannot change that object's overall structure and reassign that to our const variable. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's have a look at another example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out the previous examples that we did, just so that the errors don't interfere with the next few examples I'm going to show you, the next example. So let's start by declaring a constant variable called myObject. And we're going to assign that to an object. I'm going to make this very generic. So the first key in this object is going to be called item1, and I'll just set that to a value of item1. And then item2 will be the second key, and I'll set that to item2. Okay, so just for good measure, let's log this to our console. Just grab this. And then we should expect to see our object printed to the console like so. So now we have an object here where we can see the key value pairs. And let's say we wanted to change one of these values. So if I decided I wanted to take my object, and off of my object I wanted to take item1 and set that to a different value. We'll say hello, for example. And now let me refresh my console, and now we can see that the first value of item1, or the new value of item1, I should say, is set to a string of hello, whereas previously it was a string of item1. So we are allowed to do this without any issue, but what we cannot do is the following. So let's say I decided I wanted to take my object and reassign it to a differently structured object. So what I mean is by taking the internal properties of the object and changing those. So let's say instead of item1, I made this item3, and I set that to a string of hello world, maybe as an example. And then I'll keep the next key as item2, and then just keep the same value of item2. So now, if you guys can notice, we still have my object here, but we've changed the internal structure by changing the key. And we've even set that to a totally different value. So now let's refresh our console and see what we get. So now we see the following: uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. So what that basically means is we've taken this const variable and we've reassigned it to a technically different object. Even though it is still an object, the internal structure of the object has changed, and we're not allowed to do this. It's very similar to the idea that if we take a const variable that is, let's say, a string or a number, and we reassign that to a different value that is, let's say, a different string or a different number, it's the same exact thing. So this is definitely something to be aware of when you are working with const variables. Another similarity between const and let variables is the way they are hoisted. Const variable declarations are hoisted to the top of their scope, but they are not initialized. So very similar to let variables. However, because with const variables, we do need to initialize them at the time of declaration. If we don't understand the hoisting behavior of const variables, we will run into inevitable errors in our program. So let me just quickly walk you guys through an example of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to quickly just comment out this block of code here so that doesn't interfere with our program. And I'm going to actually take this line on line 28 and I'm going to move it up above the declaration of the myObject variable. So notice here how we are making use of myObject in this console log statement up on line 16 before we've declared myObject here on line 18. So this will error out, and I'll just show you what the error message will tell us. So basically we see here an uncaught reference error, cannot access myObject before initialization. And notice here how it's showing the file name and the line number where this error occurred, which is here up on line 16. So what's happening here basically is that we've made a variable declaration on line 18 and we attempted to make use of our variable 2 lines before it. And what's happening here is that based on the hoisting behavior of const variables, this variable declaration will be hoisted to the top of our program scope. However, the initialized value does not get hoisted to the top of our scope. So what happens here is that myObject is trying to be accessed before its initialization, and technically there is a myObject declaration that is available here, but like what was said before, you cannot make access to a const variable unless you declare it and initialize it at the time you've declared it. So there has to be an initial value stored in this variable, otherwise we will get an error like what we're seeing here in our console. So that is how we explain the hoisting behavior of const variables. Just remember that although the declaration is available because it's been hoisted to the top of scope, the initialization is not available because we are trying to access it before it's actually happened on line 18. So the initialization happens here on line 18, even if the declaration happens before we've made use of the variable on line 16, we can't access the value because it happens, or it gets initialized to a value after we try to make use of this const variable. So I hope that makes sense to those of you who are trying to understand the hoisting behavior of const variables. So this essentially means that we will get errors if we don't initialize our const variables at the time that we declare them. They need to be initialized to some value in order to work properly. Therefore, it's important to make sure that you initialize your const variables immediately once you've declared them. So I hope this makes sense to anyone who's been wondering how to fully understand the hoisting behavior of const variables. Hopefully you guys will be able to make appropriate use of const variables in your future programs. Until the next video, I will catch you guys later.